When people think of American mafia power, they picture New York, Chicago, or Las Vegas. They imagine violence in the open, famous bosses, public trials, and headlines that never stop. They almost never think about St. Louis. That's exactly why it worked. St. Louis was never supposed to be a mafia city. It didn't have the population of New York. It didn't have the myth of Chicago. It didn't have the glamour of Las Vegas. What it had was something far more useful. Silence. In the years after World War II, St. Louis was a city in transition. Industry was booming. Transportation routes were expanding. Labor unions were powerful. Construction was everywhere. Money moved constantly, but quietly. And where money moves quietly, organized crime pays attention. The Mafia didn't arrive in St. Louis with violence. It arrived with patience. No gunfights. No public intimidation. No obvious takeovers. Instead, it embedded itself inside systems that already existed. The city's geographic position made it valuable. St. Louis sat at the center of major railways, highways, and river routes. Goods passed through it constantly. So did cash. This made it ideal for gambling operations, loan sharking, union control, and money laundering. But unlike other cities, St. Louis didn't have a reputation for corruption. That reputation gap created opportunity. Local authorities weren't looking for a mafia presence because they didn't believe one existed. That belief was the first weakness. The second weakness was fragmentation. St. Louis law enforcement was divided across jurisdictions. City police, county police, state authorities, and federal agencies all operated with limited coordination. No single force had a complete picture of what was happening. This allowed organized crime to operate below the surface. The Mafia's approach in St. Louis was not domination. It was placement. Key positions mattered more than territory. Labor unions were an early target. Unions controlled who worked, who didn't, and where money flowed. By influencing union leadership, quietly, indirectly, the Mafia gained leverage over construction projects, trucking routes, and industrial contracts. No threats were needed. If you controlled the paperwork, you controlled the outcome. Gambling was another pillar. Illegal gambling operations spread through backrooms, private clubs, and discreet locations. These weren't flashy casinos. They were low-profile, reliable revenue streams. Small enough to avoid attention. Large enough to generate influence. Money from gambling fed into loans. Loans created dependency. Dependency created silence. The Mafia didn't need the public to fear them. They needed people to rely on them. This is where St. Louis became different from other Mafia cities. There was no need to enforce control with violence when cooperation was more profitable. People who benefited from the system had no incentive to expose it. And people who suspected something wrong rarely had proof. The organization that emerged in St. Louis was disciplined and insular. It avoided publicity. It avoided internal conflict. It avoided unnecessary expansion. It focused on stability. Leadership was centralized but invisible. Decisions were made quietly. Orders passed through trusted intermediaries. If you didn't know what to look for, you wouldn't see it. That invisibility was the greatest strength. Federal attention focused elsewhere. New York's families were fighting. Chicago's outfit was making noise. Las Vegas was exploding with activity. St. Louis stayed quiet. Too quiet. For decades, the Mafia operated in the city without major disruption. Businesses functioned normally. Elections happened. Construction continued. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. But beneath that normality, influence was everywhere. Contract bids favored certain companies. Union disputes resolved predictably. Gambling debts disappeared without complaint. Patterns existed, but they were subtle. The Mafia's control didn't feel like control. It felt like order. That's why it lasted. When law enforcement did begin to notice, it struggled to respond. There were no clear crimes to prosecute. No public victims. No dramatic incidents. What existed instead were relationships. And relationships are hard to arrest. Witnesses didn't come forward. Those who benefited stayed silent. Those who didn't benefit feared consequences. Not necessarily violence, but exclusion. Being shut out of work was punishment enough. The Mafia understood something fundamental about power in mid-century America. You don't need to terrorize a city to control it. You just need to insert yourself into the systems it depends on. St. Louis became a model of that strategy. The organization's strength wasn't measured in body counts, but in how long it remained undisturbed. 4 years, it worked. Until it didn't. Because no system remains invisible forever. As federal agencies began to modernize, intelligence sharing improved. Surveillance expanded. Wiretaps became more common. Patterns that once seemed unrelated began to connect. Union leadership. Business contracts. Gambling operations. A picture slowly emerged. Not of chaos, but of coordination. Investigators realized they weren't dealing with scattered corruption. They were dealing with an organized structure designed to avoid detection. By the time the Mafia in St. Louis attracted serious federal attention, it was deeply embedded. Removing it would not be simple. It wouldn't be a raid. It would be a dismantling. And dismantling a system that thrives on silence requires patience equal to the one that built it. That is where the story turns. Because the Mafia didn't lose St. Louis through a single arrest or dramatic collapse. It lost it slowly, as the very tools it used to remain invisible were turned against it. That part of the story reveals something even more unsettling. The same quiet control that allowed the Mafia to take over St. Louis also allowed it to survive far longer than anyone expected. And when it finally fell, it wasn't because the city fought back. It was because silence stopped protecting it. That's where the next chapter begins. The beginning of the end did not arrive with sirens or arrests. It arrived with attention. For decades, the Mafia's greatest protection in St. Louis had been the absence of scrutiny. Investigators were busy elsewhere. Resources were stretched. Organized crime units focused on cities where violence made headlines. St. Louis stayed off the list. That changed slowly, almost imperceptibly, as federal law enforcement evolved. The shift wasn't driven by a single case or a single informant. It was driven by a realization that organized crime didn't always look like chaos. Sometimes, it looked like efficiency. As agencies began sharing information more systematically, patterns that once seemed coincidental began to align. A union leader connected to a construction firm. A construction firm connected to a trucking company. A trucking company connected to known gambling operations. None of these connections were illegal on their own. Together, they told a story. Investigators began to suspect that St. Louis wasn't a city with isolated corruption problems. It was a city with a coordinated structure operating beneath legitimate business. This realization forced a change in approach. Traditional policing methods were ineffective against what existed in St. Louis. There were no street wars to infiltrate. No public rackets to disrupt. No obvious kingpins issuing visible orders. The organization functioned like a quiet boardroom, not a battlefield. Federal agents began to map relationships instead of crimes. Who met whom? Who benefited when contracts were awarded? Who resolved disputes without litigation? The Mafia's discipline, once its strength, became its vulnerability. Consistency created patterns. Surveillance increased. Wiretaps were authorized more frequently. Financial records were examined with new scrutiny. This was slow work. Months passed without arrests. Years passed without headlines. But pressure was building. For the first time, the Mafia's invisibility was being challenged not by force, but by patience. Ironically, the same patience that had allowed the organization to embed itself now worked against it. As investigators listened quietly, they learned how decisions flowed. Orders were rarely explicit. Language was coded. Conversations avoided detail. But silence speaks. When certain names appeared repeatedly across unrelated investigations, suspicion deepened. When outcomes consistently favored the same circle of individuals, attention sharpened. The Mafia had relied on the assumption that legality provided cover. It didn't. Because legality does not mean independence. The federal government began to view the St. Louis organization not as a collection of criminals, but as an enterprise. That shift in perspective was crucial. Instead of asking, "What crimes did this person commit?" investigators asked, "How does this system function?" That question unlocked everything. They saw how union pressure influenced bids, how gambling profits moved through legitimate accounts, how disputes were settled quietly to avoid exposure. The Mafia had become a problem of structure, not behavior. And structure can be dismantled. The introduction of broader conspiracy laws changed the balance. Investigators no longer needed to prove individual acts of violence or extortion. They needed to show participation in an ongoing criminal enterprise. This reframing was devastating. People who had avoided risk by staying within technical legality now faced exposure for association alone. Silence became dangerous. Loyalty wavered. Some participants realized that their protection depended entirely on the organization's continued invisibility, and invisibility was slipping. The first cracks appeared in cooperation. Not dramatic confessions. Not public defections. Quiet conversations. A business owner sharing information off the record. A union official answering questions a little too fully. A gambler clarifying relationships he once obscured. Each small disclosure weakened the system. The Mafia responded by tightening internally. Communication reduced. Meetings became rarer. Decisions centralized further. This caution slowed operations, and ironically made patterns clearer. The organization had built itself to survive through silence. But silence only works when no one is listening closely. By the time arrests finally came, they felt anticlimactic. No massive raids. No public spectacle. Just indictments. Charges laid out methodically, linking individuals through enterprise, conspiracy, and financial flow. The Mafia's control in St. Louis didn't collapse overnight. It receded. Contracts changed hands. Union influence weakened. Gambling operations shut down quietly. The city adjusted. What surprised many observers was how little resistance occurred. There was no uprising. No backlash. No visible fight. That was because the organization had never ruled through fear. It had ruled through convenience. And once that convenience became liability, cooperation evaporated. People who had once benefited from the system now distanced themselves. They sought legitimacy. They avoided contact. The Mafia found itself isolated, not by force, but by withdrawal. This was the opposite of how organized crime traditionally falls. There was no violent purge. No dramatic betrayal. Just a slow erosion of relevance. The city moved on. For federal authorities, the St. Louis case became a quiet success story, but also a warning. It demonstrated that organized crime did not need violence to thrive. It needed opportunity, fragmentation, and complacency. It showed how systems designed for order can be exploited by those willing to operate beneath attention. And it proved that dismantling such systems requires patience equal to the one that built them. The Mafia did not fail because it made noise. It failed because it was finally seen. The lesson was clear. Power that hides inside systems is hardest to detect and hardest to remove. St. Louis was not taken over by force. It was absorbed. And when the absorption ended, the city barely noticed. That may be the most unsettling part of the story, because it means that similar systems can exist anywhere attention is low, coordination is weak, and silence is mistaken for safety. The Mafia didn't conquer St. Louis. It integrated into it. And only when integration became visible did control finally slip away. What remains is not a cautionary tale about crime alone, but about how power operates best when it doesn't look like power at all. That understanding reshaped federal strategy going forward. And it continues to influence how authorities think about organized crime today. The story doesn't end with arrests. It ends with a realization. And that realization belongs in the final chapter. By the time federal pressure began to seriously affect the Mafia's operations in St. Louis, the organization was already adapting. It always had. The Mafia did not view law enforcement attention as an emergency. It viewed it as a signal to slow down, not to fight back. Violence would only draw more attention. Public confrontation would undo decades of careful invisibility. So instead of resisting, the organization did something more effective. It withdrew. Gambling operations became smaller and more discreet. Loans were collected quietly or written off entirely. Union influence softened, not because it disappeared, but because it no longer needed to be overt. Control shifted from action to presence. The Mafia understood that the safest position was no longer expansion, it was preservation. This transition made investigations more difficult in the short term. As activity declined, evidence became harder to gather. Surveillance produced fewer results. Wiretaps captured long stretches of nothing. From the outside, it appeared as though the problem was resolving itself. In reality, it was evolving. The Mafia had survived by embedding itself inside systems. Now, it began to dissolve into them. Members reduced direct contact. Trusted intermediaries took over communication. Decisions were delayed, sometimes indefinitely. This created frustration among investigators. The absence of criminal activity did not mean the absence of criminal influence. It meant the influence had become passive. St. Louis entered a strange period where the Mafia's footprint was shrinking, but its shadow remained. Contracts that once flowed through controlled channels still favored familiar names. Union leadership still carried the residue of old loyalties. Business relationships did not dissolve overnight. Systems remember. This is one of the least understood aspects of organized crime. Even after an organization weakens, the structures it shaped continue to function in similar ways. Habits persist. Expectations remain. People still knew which calls mattered, which relationships smoothed problems, which names carried weight. The Mafia no longer needed to give orders. The system operated on memory. This created a challenge for law enforcement. How do you dismantle something that no longer actively operates? How do you prosecute influence when behavior looks legal? The answer, once again, was patience. Federal agencies shifted focus from disruption to documentation. They studied historical patterns. They tracked how decisions continued to align in predictable ways. They treated the Mafia not as a current threat, but as a legacy embedded in infrastructure. This required a different kind of investigation, one that did not chase crimes, but mapped continuity. Over time, the picture clarified. The Mafia's power in St. Louis was no longer centralized. It was dispersed, fragmented, diluted. That dilution was both a strength and a weakness. It made the organization harder to detect, but also harder to maintain. Without centralized enforcement, loyalty weakened. Without consistent profit, participation declined. The Mafia did not collapse. It aged. Older members retired or passed away. Younger generations lacked the same discipline and patience. The city itself changed. Economic shifts reduced the power of traditional unions. Gambling moved online and became legalized in many forms. Transportation networks modernized. The systems that once made St. Louis fertile ground for quiet control began to erode. The Mafia did not adapt as easily to these changes. Its greatest strength, discretion, became less relevant in a world driven by data, transparency, and centralized oversight. By the time law enforcement publicly acknowledged the decline of organized crime influence in St. Louis, the decline had already happened. There was no moment of victory, just absence. This quiet ending contrasts sharply with popular Mafia narratives. No dramatic arrests, no courtroom spectacles, no violent finales. The organization simply lost relevance. That loss, however, does not mean the story lacks warning. If anything, it makes the lesson more disturbing. Because the Mafia did not fail due to moral outrage or public resistance. It failed because systems changed. Which means that in environments where systems remain fragmented, outdated, or complacent, similar structures can still thrive. St. Louis was not unique. It was instructive. The city demonstrated how organized crime can exist comfortably inside normal life, invisible, cooperative, and efficient. It showed how silence can be a tool of power. And it proved that the most effective criminal organizations are not those that dominate headlines, but those that avoid them entirely. This realization influenced future federal strategies. Authorities began paying closer attention to cities without obvious crime problems. They studied labor unions, transportation hubs, and financial flows with renewed interest. The assumption that organized crime only thrived in loud environments was finally abandoned. Quiet cities became suspicious. This shift did not eliminate organized crime, but it made invisibility harder to maintain. The Mafia's story in St. Louis is not about brutality. It is about alignment. Aligning with existing systems. Aligning with incentives. Aligning with silence. For decades, that alignment worked. Until the systems themselves evolved. That is the real ending, even if it lacks drama. The Mafia did not lose St. Louis to law enforcement alone. It lost it to modernization, to coordination, to a world that became less tolerant of informal control. Yet the lesson remains relevant. Because wherever systems rely on trust, routine, and fragmentation, they remain vulnerable. Power does not need to announce itself to exist. It only needs to be convenient. And that is why the story of the St. Louis Mafia matters, not as history, but as a pattern that can repeat, unless it is recognized. In the end, the Mafia did not lose St. Louis in a courtroom or a shootout. It lost it quietly. There was no moment when power was ripped away. No dramatic collapse. No public reckoning. The organization faded because the environment that once protected it no longer existed. The systems changed. What had once made St. Louis vulnerable, fragmented oversight, quiet economic power, informal relationships, slowly disappeared. Law enforcement became coordinated. Financial trails became traceable. Silence stopped being invisible. And when silence stops protecting power, power has nowhere to hide. The Mafia's greatest weapon in St. Louis had never been fear. It was convenience. It solved problems quietly. It kept money moving. It offered stability where uncertainty existed. For a long time, that was enough. But convenience only works when no one asks how it functions. Once those questions began to surface, slowly, patiently, the structure could no longer sustain itself. Not because it was weak, but because it depended on being unseen. The disappearance of Mafia influence in St. Louis is unsettling precisely because it lacks spectacle. It reminds us that control does not always look like domination. Sometimes it looks like normality. And that is the real warning. Organized crime does not require chaos to succeed. It requires opportunity. It requires systems that assume good faith. It requires attention focused elsewhere. St. Louis was never conquered. It was absorbed. And when absorption ended, the city moved on without ever fully realizing how deeply control had once reached. That does not make the story less important. It makes it more relevant. Because the conditions that allowed this to happen were not unique to one city or one era. They exist wherever power flows quietly, oversight is fragmented, and silence is mistaken for safety. The Mafia in St. Louis did not teach law enforcement how to fight violence. It taught them how to look for influence. That lesson continues to shape investigations today. And it serves as a reminder that the most effective criminal systems are rarely the loudest ones. They are the ones that fit so neatly into everyday life that they disappear from view. Until they don't. That is how the Mafia took over St. Louis. And that is how it lost it, not through force, but through exposure. Silence built the empire. Attention ended it.